Hello, I'm Thomas. I work at the IFRS Foundation. Julian?
Yeah, and Julian Murfitt. Well, I'm the CEO, one of the founders of Mekon from now 30 years, and helped Thomas through this process. So hopefully together we'll give you a good overview. So yeah, I'll go to the next slide, which I think is going to be the all important. Make sure that is working. Just 2 secs. My apologies. Over to you, Tom.
It's just the usual disclaimer, which many of you, having presented in the past, will be familiar with, which is that all the opinions expressed here are entirely my own. I work at the IFRS Foundation, but the views expressed are my own rather than the foundation. So without any further ado, we can jump straight into the presentation. Next slide, please, Julian. Okay, great. So actually, Stefan gave me a very nice segue into the presentation, having mentioned PwC. We're a not-for-profit, and we set financial reporting standards. And it's on the basis of those standards that companies release their financial reports. So the standards are used by auditors, by regulators, by investors and private companies. And essentially what they do is they tell all of those people how the company is doing in terms of the numbers, amongst other things. When I mention all of those parties, I think it's fair enough to say that our standards underpin financial markets, the global financial markets, and are very much integral to a global economy. It's all about comparability of information about companies, many of whom compete with each other. So I think that sets the stage nicely for the practical bit, which Stefan spoke about, because I'm not here to tell you about financial reporting standards, except as a piece of content. 3 years ago now, we determined that our content management system was in need of updating. And after a competitive tender, we selected AEM and AEM XML docs. But even before we found our new system, we were always very much aware that we're a reasonably small outfit, and we lacked the internal resource and know-how to really to implement a system as well as we would have liked to. In short, we needed a partner, which is where Julian comes in. Now, before I pass on to Julian, though, I should say that we're a relatively small organization, and there may be many in the audience today who work for very large organizations with access to resources that I can only dream of. So why would you possibly want an implementation partner? And I would say to that it is actually one of the most important things that you can do, both in terms of expanding or bolstering your specialist knowledge, but also in terms of upskilling your internal teams, because an implementation partner who does this work as their business as usual, and has done this before, will always be incredibly helpful in avoiding some of the pitfalls, but also identifying some of the opportunities that you may overlook entirely in your drive to deliver. So we were incredibly lucky to find a partner in Mekon, and Julian will tell you a little bit more about his organization.
Yeah, and I won't dwell too much on this because clearly you want to get into the details of this. But yeah, to say that we've been around for a number of years now. In fact, importantly, we started out as an Adobe partner back in early 90s as a FrameMaker partner. In fact, one of the early FrameMaker solutions partners in the UK. So we've been working with documents and content for many years, and now have been really pleased to be still working with Adobe, but now with their new technologies. And clients, although in fact IFRS are in the UK, many of our clients are all over the world. And that's perhaps depicted by the classic the classic slide that show these types of companies. But what I'd like to make about point here is really that regardless of what your business is, your second business is publishing. And we see three types of company. There's those companies that have to support a product or service. I think I could say two companies really. There's the company that has to support a product or service, like manufacturers, engineering, and then there are those that their whole business is the content, the documentation, and that's really government and companies like IFRS or organisations. And we've worked with many of them, and they all have common challenges. And so we've found that there are a number of steps that you can follow that will ensure a pretty good result. And in fact, this slide was actually developed by IFRS in terms of what they want, and it fitted very well with the way we engage with clients. And so let's start getting into some of the detail of what we did to get the result that we have. And I'd start with these six. We'll start with the three and say the roadmap and investment engagement. I mean, it's probably a bit of a worn-out phrase that, you know, the roadmap piece. If you picked up a map and you have no idea of where you're going, the roadmap or the map you're using is probably of little use. So the first thing you need to do is understand where you're going. What is your mission? What's your objectives? And maybe that will take on some form of shape of a minimum viable product. Until you have that, it's really a bit too early to then think about what your investment is. You don't know what your end goal is. You don't know what investment you're going to require. A long journey requires more fuel, right? And a short journey, well, you may not need to top up the tank. And then you can think about the passengers and the people that you're going to take along with you on that journey. That's a change management piece. So those first three are really critical. And so before I go into the prototype, Thomas, what would you reflect on that? Are there some key things that you can remember at that early phase of the project?
Yeah, absolutely, Julian. One of the key things, and many of you will be surprised by investment preceding engagement. This is one of my key lessons from this project, and that is you have to have a firm grasp as a technologist, as a delivery leader of what it is that you can do. And engagement should only happen after you know and understand what it is that you can afford. In other words, too often what happens is engagement happens first, and there's this grand vision of the art of the possible. And then only after pitching that to all the various stakeholders, hopefully not external ones, you ask for the investment piece or try to secure it, and realize that the pot of money allotted to you will only stretch that far, and suddenly you find yourself on the back foot trying to manage expectations. And I think that's ideally to be avoided. Establish what your minimum viable product is, ensure that funding is available, then proceed to engage. And you can pivot, of course, but that's what I would say to those 3 points.
Definitely. And I can't help myself thinking about this analogy of the holiday, because we're all desperate to go on holiday at the moment, aren't we? If you're going to, you've got to set out where you want to go and then think about how much it's going to cost. But maybe, and then consider the needs of the passengers, and then might want a prototype, because if you're going to go on a caravan holiday, because you've never done that before, I suggest you do one just for a short weekend before you go away for a caravanning holiday for a month, because you just might find it's not right for you. So that leads me nicely into this idea of a prototype. I see this more and more. People will do small prototyping. Could be what we class as a conference room prototype. It could be something a bit more detailed, but you're testing out your ideas, the concept, the thinking, to make sure they're valid before you start getting into the picture of the thumbprint there, the fingerprint, your DNA. When you start developing something specific to the customer, you've already tested it out to make sure that it's going to be a good fit before you've made that investment. And then, of course, then you can start looking towards the delivery. And in this case, the delivery is talking about delivering the solution, not what often gets talked about, which is your delivery mechanism and delivery platform, which we do touch on in a few slides later with the web delivery. So let's move swiftly in. And in fact, Thomas, I think you've got something that just summarizes some of the takeaways, and then we'll get cracking into some of the meat.
Yeah, absolutely. And as part of this, why don't I start there actually, because Stefan mentioned the PwC presentation, and one of the things that I wanted to, he had actually posted the do's and don'ts, lessons learned from PwC. And all of those really resonated with me, and I felt that maybe sharing 2 or 3 key lessons learned would be helpful to all of you out there. Having said this, I think the PwC slide or table is excellent, but there were 3 things that came to mind, and they're very much aligned with this, how to do it in 6 easy steps thing. One is, don't kick your architecture or big problems down the line. It's very difficult to undo architectural decisions, whether it's data or information architecture, when you're actually in the development cycle. Second, I think what I have found is collaborative working is key. But there must be one visionary, and that one visionary can be for a certain component of a system you're delivering, or for the overall project. But the analogy here is to the chef in the kitchen. There may be many cooks in the kitchen, but there's only one chef. And I think by having that visionary, you avoid the usual pitfalls of things being decided by committee and then found to be suboptimal during the development stage. And then finally, and this is a key point, and one that I think is more relevant now than it has ever been in the past. Don't take too long. I think this is one of the lures and one of the huge advantages of an off-the-shelf system, and I feel very, very strongly about this. The reason for this is the world is moving very, very quickly. And when I speak to other organizations out there, as we all do, many have the advantage of having access to immense resources, again, that I can only dream of. And invariably, the comment to me is, well, we can deliver a better system. We can do this better than Adobe or another vendor. And I always ask, okay, what's the time frame? And even with a large development team, it's always 18 months, 24 months, 2 to 3 years. And you just think to yourself, well, but the world is changing so rapidly. What we bought off the shelf 2 to 3 years ago has evolved. Adobe has made some significant investments, and we've benefited from those. And you just think to yourself, well, you're going to start building in 2021. By the time you launch in 2022, 2023, 2024, the world will be a different place. So without further ado, let me just address some key points, and let's get into the meat of the presentation, so to speak. So the 3 key takeaways are DITA has really helped us transform, and in a revolutionary way rather than an evolutionary way, our content creation and distribution operation. We started using AEM as a platform for XML docs only, but are now using it for full website delivery. And together they represent something very, very special, as you will hopefully agree by the end of the presentation. We're in the midst of delivering a business process and technology transformation, and the end goal is to better serve our stakeholders and customers, something that I think the previous presenter touched on in the question session. And I think that's what it's all about, isn't it? Irrespective of who you are out there listening to this presentation, what line of business you are in, it's all about improving customer end user outcomes. And I think that that is one of the strands that runs through this presentation. So, Julian, if we could move to the next slide, please. Okay. So we've chosen to focus in on three very specific areas of improvement, simply because our time is limited. If you're interested in specific details, if you're interested in something that we only touch on briefly or don't touch at all, please feel free to get in touch with Julian and myself anytime after the presentation. I think it's always interesting to speak to people who deal with content in one way or another, and I think a support network is often very, very helpful. So don't be shy. Get in touch by way of LinkedIn or any other way, and we'll try to help, within reason, of course. Not going to design your system, but so the first topic that we're going to cover is managing complex content, which is all about delivering complicated information or large information sets to the end user. As you have heard, Julian has an enormous amount of experience in this area, having dealt with a variety of customers in a number of areas. So, Julian, complex content managing.
Yeah, I mean, I think just one little point on this, of course, is that as this is quite openly a DITA-orientated conference, we're allowed to use the DITA word, and it's true to say that DITA is complex. Okay, anybody working with DITA will know it's complex, and anybody who says it isn't is possibly misleading you. So why am I saying that? Well, of course, it's because we are looking after a complex content that we want something that is capable to deal with it. If our content was not complex, if it was very simple and it had a simple point of delivery, then we wouldn't need to use DITA. And so I think that is probably a test. If your content, your requirements are of a detailed nature, then you're going to need something that's got the power. And I think that's a really important thing for people to recognize. And it's a nice segue into multi-channel publishing, because if you want multi-channel publishing, then you're going to need to give your content some semantic richness. And this is really where that complexity starts to pay dividends. And so I won't go into too much detail on the multi-channel piece, because we'll cover that in a few slides later. But then perhaps I can lead to, and Thomas, you might refer to this, but I know Thomas is going to show us a couple of screenshots of the website. And so that will then, if you like, close the gap of here's our CMS experience working with AEM, or the documentation add-on for AEM. And then how is that then culminated into being able to publish to not just other output types, which we'll cover, but also the core driver for the user experience, which is the website. So I think that covers these three pieces in a high level. Thomas, did you want to say anything more about that, or should we jump straight into the detail of this complexity?
Let's jump straight in, Julian. The CMS bit we can explain or touch on in the next slide. Next slide. So managing complex content change, and I think that the change here is important, because if we were simply managing a complex content set, that in itself is not as difficult, I feel, and you may well disagree, but complex content that is continuously changing, as our standards do, presents an entirely new set of challenges, especially if you're outputting it in multiple formats. And I think that our set of rules runs to approximately 5,500 pages this year. That in itself is a lot, but our rules change all the time. And actually, our end users need to understand what those rules are now, what they were 2 or 3 years ago, on what they're going to be 3 to 5 years from now. Within reason, of course. And this is where DITA really does come into its own. With DITA and AEM docs, we have avoided any major specialization, but yet we have delivered a really flexible system that significantly improves our ability to respond to our end users and better service them. And I think again, there is real complexity here. It's very difficult to unwrap it in the context of a 45-minute presentation. But in this instance, we will try by explaining a little bit about our variant work. So, Julian, over to you for date filtering, etc.
Yes, let's look at that. I mean, there's a few points here on the slide, and then I'll show you some detail of this. We're talking here about date filtering, as you can see, the date filtering and specific dates, which then drives the requirement for the standard and the types of people that are using the standard. And in fact, this is where we did do a little bit of specialization, but we didn't go mad. In fact, it's just a small amount of specialization for the date attribute. And we then applied that so that we can manage the enforced date, which is a specific requirement for the standard. And this allows us to change or to control both a whole standard, but also a small section of it, or even literally just one paragraph. So let's have a little look at a bit of the XML. We don't want to get into the detail, of course, but it's just to show what's behind the scenes if you want to get more into the detail here. So we have a variant, and we chose this approach rather than using conditions, because just conditions were going to be getting too complicated. So it allows us a lot more power to control that complexity. And in this case, you can see in the yellow box, we've got this variant base, and it's just really showing you how we've done the tag. And in fact, we use a body diff element here just for completeness. And that, as I say, allows us to turn it on and turn it off. We've got, let's see if I can go on to that. The way this will do is it actually filters out what we don't want. So we can set the dates within a pre-processing process at the point of publishing, whether we're publishing to whatever output, it doesn't matter. And then it will actually concatenate this and clean it up and take out everything that's not relevant. And as I say, it will actually split it up into whether it's a whole topic or whether it's just one element within a topic. We apply this to a number of other areas as well. But I think that's probably enough and if you want to look into the detail, I can either go through this with you offline or indeed talk to one of my consultants or the developers that were behind the scenes. We try to keep things simple, but sometimes you can't just use everything out of the box. Just need to customize it a little bit, and that's really where we came to with this. Another example of this perhaps comes in. This slide, in fact, is showing something to do with what we call jurisdiction, which is actually phase 2. So the first implementation, we didn't actually cover this aspect. There were some other pieces that we did include. And so in phase 2, we started to grow. And in fact, we grew the footprint of AEM being used by other people within the business, which was a really exciting aspect for Thomas. But jurisdiction, for perhaps simplicity, is essentially saying a region or a country. And so we are able to get into the content reuse piece here. And so it's, again, another aspect of complexity, but probably one of the biggest drivers for DITA is content reuse. Everybody talks about it and say, we need to get more reuse. So how did we do this one? Well, actually, we didn't need to specialize, but we were able to make use of an existing specialization, which was the learning and training specialization. And that has a question and answer aspect to it, as you might expect with learning and training. And we were able to use this to answer this case, because the commitment you see the top left here, commitment to global financial reporting standards, is effectively a group. And then within that, we have a number of questions that sit within that group. And what we're able to do is use keys, so a unique identifier, which is actually shown here. It says jurisdiction variables / commitment. Commitment is the key, is the unique ID. And then commitment public standards was the unique ID for one of the questions. And then what we can do is keep those in a topic and then resolve them in one fell swoop for a particular region. So we're actually able to reuse the groups and the questions across many, many examples of the standard. And then one other example before perhaps Thomas can respond to that with how this really felt when it went through. In order to get to this point, we had to do some JSON conversion. So we converted the existing content through JSON into DITA, and then applied these using some XSLT, which is a scripting language. But we could also use some of these techniques for other areas like glossary and variables. As I mentioned, conditions can be quite tricky, but also cross-references. If you think of the traditional way you might do cross-references in FrameMaker, they have a specific path, and we can make it much more tolerant and let's say robust by having using this kind of key, because then it means we won't break it, and that's actually been really powerful for generating things like the glossaries. See if there's anything else on there. Thomas, do you want to give an example? Because I know we've got a few where you had like financial instruments as a spelling error, which you were able to use this to correct that. Yeah. Or any other that would give the audience a real taste of how this actually means in the flesh?
Yeah, sure. I think rather than giving you a specific example in the IFRS standards context, which may or may not be helpful, what I'll say, Julian, is this again goes back to the Q&A with the last presenter, who zeroed in on the expectation by end users for zero errors. Now, I have never, and I've been at it for a while, never published a book without some sort of a problem. But increasingly, and especially when it comes to content that is digital, you want to avoid errors. Even those small errors, such as typos, spacing, things that distract from the value of your intellectual property. And I think that content reuse, to me, is exciting for two reasons. One is what I've just spoken of, which is the elimination of risk, the reduction of risk, the ability to focus more on the value add tasks, but also the ability, and this is another strand that runs through our presentation, and it's something that Julian and I speak about quite frequently, is the need to plan for change, to ensure that your system, while robust and relatively stable, is able to take in change. So, for example, if commitment to one of these questions or answers were to change, that change can be handled in a single location and rolled out to all your various assets. And this is very, very powerful when you're dealing with something that is complex, includes multiple variants, which means that you can be speaking about tens of thousands of assets that need to be reviewed and tweaked. Here you have absolute certainty that very little or less can go wrong. Julian, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, let's lead straight into this, the next phase of that then. So now we've got all this complexity. What's it going to do for us? Now we've got these variables. How can we realize this? And I think this starts to come into this perhaps quite a new phrase, multi-channel. even events being named after this now. So multi-channel publishing is about delivering one set of content in multiple ways, maybe multiple collections of that content, certainly for different types of users. And so this is where personalization becomes a reality, right? The right content, right place, right people gets a bit overused, but I think we are actually realizing this here. Let's have a look at a couple of specifics, and perhaps Thomas, you'll pick up on this. We've got, I've got a few examples later on, but if you want to lead through this bit, and then we'll show some of the output types that we actually did.
Yeah, and I could speak at length here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep it reasonably brief. As you can see behind me, I love books. I have always loved books. They were my first love, so to speak. But in 2021, there are only one channel to market. And the truth of it is that even when you publish books, continue to publish books in volume, just like the IFRS Foundation does, you cannot afford for your data and information architecture to be print-centric only. When we started on the content management system project, we spoke to a large number of stakeholders, and what became very clear to us is that their expectations and their needs went far beyond books. There were people who were interested in our XML filtered. There were people interested in receiving Word. There were people interested in PDF. Each one of these represents both a channel and a product. And I think that what became very, very clear was that we would, at the heart of our system, we would have a single source of truth. A single source of truth in the form of our XML. And we would then use it to generate all the various formats. And this gave us a little bit more flexibility in terms of project delivery, because we knew that certain of those formats were more important than others. And therefore, we zeroed in or focused on those, piggybacked all of the development, subsequent development from those efforts, which were initially focused on, indeed, PDF and print. But we always knew that that was not going to be the end of our journey. And as you will see, that journey has continued with that XML now servicing a full-fledged website. So I think, Julian...
yeah. I can pick up that.
Yeah, go on.
Like, and so just leading through some of those examples, and you'll see the point there that Antenna House, and I wanted to raise this because actually I think it's important for those that may not realise it. There are a number of different ways of producing PDF. There are perhaps less ways of producing Word, and then HTML5. Well, I guess you could just keep throwing different development at it. Within Mekon, we have a number of ways of producing output for PDF. InDesign is a really powerful tool that actually we can now pump DITA content into, and that has been very interesting in the pharma and medical device area, where they want really high fidelity. We're getting more and more customers using FrameMaker and the FrameMaker publishing engine for producing outputs, where they can actually have more of a WYSIWYG authoring experience and then produce output. And in this particular project, the ultimate requirement was fulfilled with Antenna House, which is yet another publishing engine, very fast piece of kit, but it does require some customized development. It requires a professional development team. So that perhaps is a negative, but the benefit, the positive being it's very fast. But let's just run into some specifics around, let's say, the Word one. Word, there we go for a little example of Word. Oh, it's just a table. Well, it's not just a table, it's got graphics in it. Nothing's ever just a table in Word, is it? We've had some great fun with producing output over the years with Word. RTF was just not sufficient. It didn't have the power. And in fact, we used the Elliott Kimber's Wordinator to produce this output. It requires some customization. It's a toolkit, if you like, but it does give us the power to be able to create output that is actually useful for the end customer. The end customer being IFRS's end customer, of course, because they want access to it to be able to manipulate and do other things with it. But this, in fact, you can barely see it, but down at the bottom there's a couple of lines and an arrow, and that is actually a graphic. So we're not just dealing with a table, we're actually dealing with tables and columns that have to be extracted and then putting in images as well. And if you've ever tried doing that just from PDF, you'll know that you can get a real mess. So just a little bit of thought. And I think there's some examples here with the code, and I don't want to go into the detail of this, but just really to illustrate that we've actually broken it down into quite a good structure. So DITA has the power to do it. You just might need some scripting in order to achieve that. And in fact, I think Thomas, I said, why did you want Word? I mean, surely you don't need Word. We've got this cool DITA thing, but it's not quite like that, is it?
No, and I tell you what, Julian, Word has been a persistent bugbear for this team for the last decade. Actually, many of you will laugh, but I was only able to retire backward conversion into the .doc, so the 1997-2001 version of Word about 2 years ago. And the reason for that is our standards are adopted in 154 different jurisdictions. Many of those jurisdictions translate the standards. The translators can be a little bit old school. And by that, I mean, just imagine what you're looking for is not only a translator who can translate from deeply technical English into whatever language you're in, but someone who can also translate the nuance of financial reporting rules. It's a rare beast indeed. And so many people specialize in this sort of thing and stay at it for a while. They may be running an old clunky IBM machine that hasn't been upgraded or patched, but we still need to service them because the standard setter may not have very many options or may trust this particular translator to do a really, really good and swift job on the standards. So again, it's about servicing a very, very specific user group or an end user in a sense.
Indeed. And then just last sort of furlong, if you like, starting with the HTML5 output, which of course you can imagine will then lead to the web. And again, we wrote, in fact, in this case, we used the DITA Open Toolkit and we modified the standard output to create the requirement we had here. This was actually the second round we did it. The first time we did fairly basic output for the MVP, which would then allow us to fit the content into an existing architecture, a website architecture. That gave us quite a lot of restrictions. And then we had the wonder of the phase 2, you could argue, where we were actually introducing AEM, which we're talking about next, AEM sites, that is, and we can actually have a bit more freedom. And I suppose the thing to point out here is there's a little bit of code to show you that, but actually I'm more interested in the green text, which we show later, I think, on the website. The green text, I think, is fun because you're only interested in the green text if you want to get a first at Oxford, it's the phrase that Thomas told me, and it's the explanation. And so this is, again, another example of personalization. Not everybody is going to read the green text. Not everybody needs access to it or wants to review. But if you do, then how do you reveal that? And again, we've done that within the power of the semantic, richness of DITA. Thomas, do you have anything else here, or should we just jump straight to that web and then we can lead through to what that felt like?
Yeah, I think, again, a general point, Julian, and this is something that we have spoken about. Actually, we've been speaking about it for almost 4 years now, which is how powerful content layering can be. And when Julian points to the green text, this is an ideal example, as is the red box you see here. In other words, you no longer think of content content as a static two-dimensional object. I'm going to really compromise myself here, but we think of it in a multiplicity of dimensions. So here's our content plus this additional stuff. Here's our content plus all of this additional stuff. And then, of course, there's the time element. Perhaps this box that we're pointing to in red, or one of the green references, did not exist in 2019, but does in 2021. Things get complex very, very quickly. And again, this is where detail comes into its own by permitting content layering and filtration. It's a really powerful mechanism, and you can do lots with it, and we've done lots with it. It's still actually, when I think back to those early days of looking at the various systems, I think it still gives me a little bit of a thrill seeing the HTML5 output. Thinking back to how modest our project was to begin with. But let's get into the CMS, because we are running out of time. So.
Exactly, yeah. Let me show that slide for you, and I'll let you kick that off if you like. Or no, I can do that. So I guess the key thing here was we're now just showing the fact we had both the CMS and the website. And the fact that we took the advantages of the capabilities of the documentation add-on, the XML documentation add-on for Adobe Experience Manager. And then once that had established its foothold, we were able to then introduce the AEM Sites piece. And so now we have a pretty comprehensive usage of the content management part, but also now bringing in the benefits of the website. And one of the things that Thomas said that just kind of anecdotally, and we were talking about, what's the nice thing that you see about it, and it's actually the user experience. You're on a platform where you're managing content, data topics, and whatever that might bring. And then when you're getting into publishing it, while there are some routines and some steps and code in the background to process and prepare all this complex content, actually when you're testing it and checking it and then looking at the website, you're in the same user experience. And that's quite a rare piece. And actually, I asked one of my colleagues, actually Keith Nicholson, I said, what do you like? What do you like about AEM? What's one of the first quick throwaway thing? And he said, one of the great things is that you can bookmark pages. And I never really thought about that, but it means that you can bookmark a particular map or a folder or a topic and very easily go back to it. So if you're working on a particular area for a while, then you don't have to go and find it. And actually, you'll find in a lot of CMSs, you've got to go and search for that and set up your criteria for searching for this. This is just a bookmark. And if you can go back to that quite well. And in fact, one of the other things was the embedded web editor, which actually IFRS are not using at the moment, but it's one of the things that we're exploring maybe for subject matter experts in the future. But that's giving an extra powerful one. But I'm a bit conscious of time as well. So, are there anything else on there for you, Thomas? Otherwise, we'll.
No. I think we can move on.
An example is the first one for you of actually showing the new, not yet released. So they're getting a bit of a coup here.
Mm. Yeah, and but actually, since you mentioned Keith, Julian, and this is going maybe off script a little bit, but I did want to. We spoke about the importance of an implementation partner. I just wanted to speak also about your internal teams. For all of you out there, either embarking or thinking about these projects, and I think that bringing in an implementation partner can be very helpful, critical to your success sometimes. But we shouldn't overlook the importance of committed, motivated teams that are working for you. I think internal subject matter expertise can be just as useful as an implementation partner, or indeed complementary. The two of them go hand in hand. And I will say that these 3 slides are of a website under development, as I will explain in a moment. But I wanted to mention that my contribution to this new website has been limited to creating a workable vision and a roadmap for the Standards Navigator. There is a delivery team working very hard at the moment in the background, and I wanted to especially recognize the outstanding effort of that team, and specifically our CTO and our website manager. I think you cannot do these projects without people, and I think looking inwards and giving people an opportunity to develop can actually be incredibly empowering internally. So without further ado, I just wanted to talk to you very briefly about how we went from our early decisions around content granularity to metadata. And I think that it's a continuous journey. Those early decisions have fed directly into some of the things that we can do with the website. I think the flexibility stemming from granularity, which is made possible by DITA, led us to a very flexible data architecture that permits us to apply metadata to assets, individual assets at a very granular level. This tagging is key to the delivery of the website components. What happens effectively is we tag the content with metadata. That metadata is used to service the website, is ingested by the website. This is immensely flexible, but here we're speaking about immense flexibility, not only in terms of data architecture, but also immense flexibility around information architecture, which is essentially delivering the right content to the right people at the right time, personalizing, making sure that you're servicing unique user groups, as you saw in, or we touched on in the HTML5 slide. And also ensuring that when managing a very large content set, the website work is no longer as manual as many of the content management systems that I have worked in the past, in the sense that, and I think you'll see this in the next slide if you wouldn't mind, Julian. Here you can see that there are, and this is again a website under development, so forgive any rough edges, but you can see that that metadata is feeding this component directly. So related active projects, related completed projects, related IFRS standards, these are not hand-built components. All of this is driven by some very, very clever design and conceptual work on the part of the team that allows us to leverage the CMS and for the content to flow directly, HTML content or other content, PDFs, etc., residing in the DAM, which is the underlying asset storage area of AEM, to flow into the website itself. And I think, in the interest of time, again, I will, if we can move to the next slide, this slide shows you the Standards Navigator, which uses exactly the same principle, but with a very, very exciting navigational overlay. And those little P buttons that you can see there will be complemented by others in the future, but effectively they are again metadata driven. So now not only do you have content that's metadata driven, but you have signposts for end users that are metadata driven. So the distinction between function and content becomes gradually blurred to the point where, and blurred in a good way, to the point where the content drives functionality. And to me, that is immensely exciting. Julian, I think we've spoken about this at length. So your thoughts?
Yeah, and I guess let's wrap it up, because this is obviously we're running a little on time, and so what can we say to this? We've definitely seen a lot of improvements in the way we can manage content for both for delivering in different ways, but also going into the website. We've done a number of clever, let's say, scripts in the background, using taking advantage of the taxonomy, sucking that in and applying it, using the keys and automating that. We haven't even mentioned blacklining and change marks as might be used in other languages, but essentially the blacklining became a really interesting, powerful aspect to this as well. And it's been a constant assessment of maybe adjusting the information architecture or just refining it, and then always looking at the end goals, always keeping an idea of where we're going to end up with, and then sometimes coming back to the beginning of the process and refining that. And I think it's pretty impressive what the out-of-the-box functionality was, and it's still requiring some enhancement, because it is a huge toolbox. But it wouldn't have been possible if the key components weren't there already. And I think this, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of the seamless DAM and sites interaction is not insignificant. The user experience there for the team internally is actually coming out there. Not to mention perhaps the improved searchability and accurate content that the end customer is also getting. But I think that's probably enough said on that, really. Unless you have anything else over, I could go to the next slide and you can talk about the future as our final farewell.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Joe. And I couldn't agree more. I think that last point, the ability to look at your website components and then very quickly drill into the actual content that is being held or being presented to the end user, troubleshoot, adjust, take a close, enhance, super powerful. But I think, we really are running out of time. So, our website, yeah.
I think we have some questions that are coming through then, Thomas. So maybe we can use that as an opportunity to answer those. If the guys have got any that, we'd like to look through. But definitely, really.
Julian, it looks like we do have a couple extra minutes for our next presenter. So happy to get in and look at the Q&A pod. So if you can pull those up, they're great. There's some fairly specific ones. I'll go with a short one. And Peter was asking, is the IFRS specialization available? Maybe you could speak to that, Thomas?
Available in the sense of
as perhaps a DITA specialization standard? Is it an internal thing that you use?
It's an internal specialization, yeah.
Internal,
it's internal use, correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have the answer, just not the one we wanted.
Okay.
I'd love to release it to everyone, but I doubt that that's possible, even in the completely non-competitive place that a not-for-profit is.
Understood. And I hope I get the name right. I believe it's Jan or.
We can help someone re-specialize with all of that wealth of experience. Sorry, I've got to get that in.
Contact Mekon for an additional identical specialization that does not rely upon the IFRS customer work.
At the end of the day, and I should be slightly less droll because it's a serious question. At the end of the day, the specialization itself is not very complex. There's nothing that we are presenting here that is an exaggeration of the state of play. So it's not like we somehow we've designed a system that is so cool and so different that you wouldn't be able to replicate it. Actually, on the contrary, we're really surprised at how much how much out of the box gives us. And I would say we've only really calibrated it. But I think speaking to Julian is probably a better
I know. Even those on the DITA committee and the DITA specialization committees say, DITA's great. Try not to specialize. So the more true you can stay to the standard, I think the better your organization may be. And Mekon's there to help it. So.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And one of the reasons is, again, going back to the first part of the second part of the presentation, which is multi-channel. The more you specialize, the less likely or the higher your work overhead will be when trying to output into multiple channels.
Both of you were mentioning as you move forward, there is less of a reliance upon or a focus on the print output. And I was smiling during all of that because as the years go by, specifically publishing work that I do goes more to digital. And so I find it interesting that for instance, where I took something originally developed by Sarah O'Keefe for print, and then it didn't work so well when I went to digital. Modifying that stuff actually not only improved the digital, which was the intent, but I feel in a great sense it also improves the print. When you get away from that print model, then it frees up your content a little bit, even with it, even improving the print output itself, which seemed odd to me. But I think it's true.
Yeah, I can respond to that with an interesting anecdote that says, if you focus on any one output, you'll always have a limitation. We had a project not so long ago where the focus was not print at all. They were purely focused on this delivery platform, but they were so focused on this delivery platform, it created all sorts of other challenges. And they needed to back off and say, no, we've got to keep much more broad. And that's probably why you're seeing those benefits with the output to electronic actually enhancing print. It's because you're thinking more about the architecture and its needs.
And hopefully we have hundreds of people here, thousands of people who look at this and say, well, of course, you've ceased focusing on the formatting and you're now focusing on your content.
It's not so easy, right? I mean, even now
it's hard.
We have people that are still hanking into, holding on with their little fingernails.
That departure from desktop publishing is difficult for many.
Indeed.
Present company included. Yeah. Took many years. It happened a long time ago, but it took many years. Great. There is a fairly long question, so strap in here. Was any consideration made for using either the ISO STS or the NISO STS schemas for your standards content instead of DITA? If so, why did you choose DITA over STS, and were there any downsides?
Julian, I think this will be a question for you. This is where an implementation partner comes into its own, because I understand the question, but I'll respond from the perspective of an end user. I didn't really care which way we went. I'm sure one of those other options would have been perfectly good. The one thing that I wanted to get away from was our legacy bespoke DTD, which unbelievably I still, you're not going to believe it, and I'm going to think I'm exaggerating, but ran to 27 pages. So enough said. Julian?
Yeah, and I must admit, I can't say specifically on the STS because I wasn't involved at that stage. We do quite often, in early phases of what we call the content strategy audit, actually look at what the requirement is and see whether DITA is a good fit. And I can say pretty openly that we, don't always use DITA. In fact, for many who know Mekon, you'll know we do a lot in aerospace and defense. And of course, that means we use the S1000D standard. and they're different, and they have different reasons for being in existence. So while I don't think it's probably appropriate to push or pull or any of those other particular standards, it's right to challenge it. I think it's wrong to assume DITA will fix everybody's problem, but I think it's also a good thing. We're doing some work at the moment in a government project where ordinarily DITA may not feature, but we're not saying you should. What we're saying, we should try, we should test, because of course it's being used so widely around the world that it means you get all the benefit of other people investing in the standard, and that's got to be the reason we've always loved a standard. So regardless of what it is, I would say that's fine. If another standard is being adopted, you might say PIM, for instance, in pharma. Well, the trouble is that's not really a publishing standard, and so it may fall short. So you may need to support PIM, but you also may need to use DITA to get to where you need. So I think that's the factor here. It's definitely not a simple answer, right?